Hello and welcome to the NetScaler Podcast. My name is Brian Huhn, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jason Poole. Together, we explore the ins and outs of application delivery and security, dive deep into stories from the industry, and learn about the business challenges that face IT teams and how they overcome them. In this episode, Jason and I are going to take a look at the results of some third-party performance testing that compared NetScaler VPX and F5's Big IP Virtual Edition in real-world ADC environments. The performance difference was quite staggering and shows why so many customers choose NetScaler to deliver and secure their apps and data. Jason, can you share your thoughts on the key takeaways to get us started?
Sure. Thank you, Brian. You're right. The performance differences were very stark indeed. And for me, the key takeaway was that NetScaler consistently outperformed F5 in every test scenario. And as the workload tasks increased, the differences became even more pronounced. And we'll get into the specifics later on in the podcast. But at a high level, for a given workload, NetScaler exhibited 3 times the throughput, 64% less CPU utilization, and induced a tiny fraction of the latency that F5 did. But the most staggering result was the induced latency when the number of connected users increased. F5 added up to 26 times the latency that NetScaler did.
Wow, that's a lot to take in, and that's some pretty crazy results. But I want to go over these results with you in more detail, but I'd first like to go over some of the testing procedures with you before we discuss those implications. But before we do all that, let's remind our audience of why application performance is important in general. I think this will help everyone understand the implications of the test and why the performance difference between the two ADCs is so important.
It's no secret that we live in an application and API economy right now. Everything is controlled by some sort of application, whether it's the e-commerce online store, the manufacturing process of cars, or even patient care in the health service industry. There is an application underneath everything controlling the process. Even the person who sweeps the floor likely has to input the timings that he did it in or she did it in into an app on an iPad or similar. And all businesses face problems if apps perform poorly. For e-commerce, that effect is pretty much in your face. Slow apps detract from business, lead to abandoned shopping carts, reduce conversions, lost sales, and of course, the associated brand damage that goes with all of that. And similarly, for financial services, once a customer experience declines, that's when they decide that they're going to leave and do their business elsewhere, and they may not even come back. And with the healthcare, poor performance there can really impact patient care. If a patient is unable to book an appointment because of a slow app, then they might delay that appointment, and that could, of course, lead to serious consequences. And if a doctor can't access health records when they need it, then they might miss something critical at a crucial time, and that has a knock-on effect for treatment. And similarly, even in manufacturing, the processes rely on applications, and slow app responses can delay recognition of issues and impact the resolution, which definitely hurts operational efficiency. And similarly, if that business relies on IoT input to diagnose problems or track issues, then a slow response can harm that as well. So because of all this, it's absolutely critical that applications are available and perform well all the time. We all know, as consumers and employees, how frustrating a poor application can be. And Brian, we've discussed this many times on the podcast that ADCs are the friend of the application and really help ensure that they perform and are available.
No, definitely. And for those who haven't seen previous episodes, they're all right here if you'd like to check them out. But before we talk a little bit more about this testing, I'd like to point out that the third-party testing vendor in this test was the Tolly Group. They've been doing this for 30 plus years, very well respected in the industry and used by just about everybody. Now, on to the next point. So, ADC vendors do performance testing like this all the time. So, what were we trying to achieve with this suite of tests?
The goal of the testing was to have an independent third party carry out fair, unbiased testing to benchmark NetScaler in a number of common scenarios that represent real-world usage of ADCs, or at least as close to real world as you can get in the lab. So in the past, vendors, including NetScaler, we've looked at testing as a single parameter, be it throughput or SSL transactions per second or something like that. And while these are valid measurements and indicate how well something performs, we decided to look at how things perform when ADCs are asked to carry out some typical tasks like load balancing, content manipulation, and application security inspections, for example. We wanted to make the conditions, as I said, as reflective of the real scenarios as we could. And this included the testing environment, the traffic mix, the response size, and then to look at the performance differences in terms of throughput, CPU, and latency.
Nice. So these tests are not just about adding more requests and seeing how the ADC performs, but to add, common tasks to the ADC that represent what customers are actually using it for, right?
Yes, that's right.
So to take another step, what were the steps and configurations that we used to replicate that real world ADC usage?
It's a great question. So one of the things that we did, we wanted to represent real usage, as we've said, and we looked at customer environments that we see and tried to replicate at least their setup. So all of the tests that we did were on encrypted traffic, since no sensible application operates in the clear today. And of course, the baseline tests, of course, they have to involve load balancing to a farm of servers behind the ADCs. That's the most important thing that the ADCs tend to do. The second type of tests involves content manipulation, and that is something that practically all customers are doing with their ADC. They load balance traffic, of course, but they might insert a client IP address for the backend, or adjust a header, or insert a cookie, or some other element to either secure the traffic better or help their monitoring systems keep track of where the request came from. And then the last suite of tests included application security inspection. So we ran basic web app firewall stuff, so WAF stuff. We ran a basic profile that inspected for cross-site scripting, SQL injections, and command injection attacks. So it's by no means a full security suite, but these are the types of inspections that everyone should be looking for in their web application environments. And we ran different combinations of these. So first of all, taking that everything's encrypted, we did load balancing on its own. That was the baseline test, if you will. Then we looked at load balancing and some content manipulation. And then we looked at load balancing and application security inspection. And then we combined all three together: load balancing, content manipulation, and application security. And we measured combinations of the CPU utilization, the throughput, and the latency to give an indication of the overall performance of the software. And we tested software, not hardware. And there's a good reason. While we see customers using hardware every day, and we know, however, there is a desire. We speak to a lot of customers. They tell us they would prefer to shift things to software. So we thought it better to test the software versions of these devices. Plus, this does actually give a pretty solid indication of the power of the software and its architecture, and it negates any hardware discrepancies that might occur.
Nice. Thanks for that. I think that was a really great explanation. And also, for those who are wondering, the actual tests were carried out on a similar EC2 instances in AWS. The latest software versions were used for both NetScaler VPX and the F5 Big IP VE. So, Jason, why was AWS used as a testing ground? And can these results be applied elsewhere?
AWS was used primarily for convenience. We could have used a different cloud vendor, or we could have set the test up on-prem and tested it there for sure. So while the actual numbers would have likely varied, it's safe to say that the overall general results can be extended to all software environments.
So, what steps were taken to ensure that the traffic pattern used was realistic?
So we had the testing group do some research on this, and there is a site called Crawler Ninja that monitors the top 1 million websites and reports on the types of traffic it sees. And when we analyzed that, we saw that 83% of web traffic is encrypted. So we used HTTPS for the testing. We saw that nearly 2/3 of that traffic was HTTP. So that was what was used in the Tolly testing. And further, we noticed that of that encrypted traffic, 3/4 of it was encrypted with the latest TLS 1.3 protocol. So we used the most typical common protocol in that. And similarly, we did a quick calculation to get an average response time, for an average response size for the traffic, and that was about 34 kilobytes. Now, the reason we want to do that and we call that out because in the past, we've seen some vendors rig the system a little bit by using massive response sizes up to 2 megabytes to simply just pass traffic without really doing any work on it so that the throughput numbers look better. And we wanted Tolly to have a fair set of tests to ensure that we were testing things as they might actually occur.
Nice. So we've put a link to the Tolly report in the description, as well as right here in the top banner. If you're watching the YouTube version of this podcast that has the graphs and the testing details, but perhaps you can talk through the results for our audio audience and just for everyone to understand it a bit better. Can you start with an overview before we dive into each of these 4 tests?
I'd be happy to, Brian. So in the first set of tests, we fixed the CPU and measured the throughput as we adjusted the number of tasks we asked the ADC to do. So in that, NetScaler achieved 3 times the throughput. Next, we kind of flipped that around a little bit and we pushed the equivalent throughput through each of the devices and monitored how the CPU varied as the number of tasks increased. And there, NetScaler used 64% less CPU. But the big wins for NetScaler were yet to come. When we looked at latency, we saw a massive 89% less latency per packet with NetScaler than F5. And for me, the biggest takeaway, as I said before, especially in the land of e-commerce where I operate more now, is that the NetScaler showed 96% less latency in every request than the big IP virtual edition when the number of users connected increased.
Wow, that's staggering.
It is, isn't it just? Yeah. But overall, the big result here, as seen in every test, is that the F5 performance degrades so much more than NetScaler when the devices are configured to carry out additional tasks. And that type of result might not be seen when simply doing basic performance testing with load balancing. And this is important because customers are not just doing load balancing on their ADC, everyone's doing a little bit more. Some content manipulation is so common. Or more importantly, some application security inspection. That's really important in the web app world. Everybody should be using this. And we see more customers consolidating their AppSec onto the ADCs. And both NetScaler and F5 suggest, quite rightly, that this is the correct thing to do. But from these results, it seemed that only NetScaler can effectively handle that extra workload.
Wow, those are some seriously astonishing results, at least from the high level. Can you maybe spend a little bit more time looking a little bit closer at each scenario specifically?
Sure. Happy to. So the first test that we did was very simple. It was a warm-up test. So pass traffic at a constant CPU, and we selected 60% CPU utilization, then measure the throughput of each device for each of the config scenarios. So we chose 60% as this is well within the operating range of an ADC. You don't want to max it out because strange things happen once you get up there. But equally, you don't want to be allocating excessive resources to an ADC such that it's barely ticking over. And we found that companies will have their own tolerance levels and before they think of adding more devices. So for some, that might be 70%, others might be more conservative, 30 or 40. So we thought 60 is a decent compromise. And in this environment, fixing the CPU and checking the throughput, so in the baseline test where we just decrypted the SSL and then load balanced to a number of servers at the back end, NetScaler achieved 1.5 times the throughput of the F5 device. So straight away, it's 50% better straight out of the gate. And when we added content manipulation to that, it was similar. And when we started to do application security inspection, the differential between the devices jumped to 2x. And then when we added all these 3 things together, NetScaler was more than triple the performance of F5. So in each case, adding tasks meant less throughput for each device, but the throughput decline on the F5 was much higher. NetScaler coped so much better with the additional tasks.
That is a big result. And For those who maybe haven't conceptualized it into real world terms, this means that if you were to be doing your load balancing, content manipulation, and AppSec for a given workload, that might mean that you need 3 times as many F5 instances as NetScaler instances, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is especially apparent when a flash crowd arrives at an application. And I've seen this in the past in previous companies where people have said, no, we'll cope. And then they've done a marketing television advert and lots of people arrive at their site. It all goes down because the applications can't cope. And that's exactly when you need an ADC that can cope with the spike in traffic. So that means that you might need to provision more or larger F5 instances in this case to ensure that the application can cope.
How about this next suite of tests? I believe we were looking at CPU utilization. Is that right?
Yeah, so the second suite of tests was kind of the reverse of the first one, really. So in this one, we held the throughput constant, and then we did the same changes and we looked at what happened to the CPU utilization. And as before, when the task's workload increased, the CPU utilization went up in response for both devices, of course, but the NetScaler coped so much better. So for the baseline tests, and also the content manipulation, NetScaler used about 35% less CPU, which is quite a difference actually. But when AppSec inspection was added, the differential climbed to 46%, which is, that's quite marked. But then something strange happened when the configuration was adjusted to carry out content manipulation and AppSec inspection on the load balancing stuff. The F5 device seemed to get really bogged down. So much so, in fact, that the test had to be moderated and the throughput reduced by 50% just so that F5 could complete the test. And when it did, the performance differential was a massive 64% less CPU on the utilization on the NetScaler. And
Wow.
that sounds like a lot, but if we flip that around and express the F5 CPU resource utilization as a multiple of the NetScalers, it equates to about 1.5 for the baseline stuff, and then up to 2.7 times the usage respectively. So overall, this points to a much more efficient use of NetScalers, of resources for the NetScaler.
So this seems to point to the fact that, again, as before, a customer might need fewer NetScaler devices for an equivalent F5 workload. So this would likely mean not only cheaper deployments, but
Hmm.
also a simpler level of management complexity. Is that right?
I agree, Brian. It absolutely, in my book, means that. So, you know, it might also indicate perhaps that an F5 customer might well have to upgrade their F5 instance. Remember that spike in traffic? They might need to say, right, we've got to have a lot more CPU to throw at this, and I have to buy much bigger instances and a bigger license. And that can be a costly exercise.
Great. So now let's take a look at that third test, the latency tests. So
Mm.
latency is a key indicator of how application performs and the user experience that they end up getting. What did these test results yield?
So the latency tests were very interesting. So to be clear, in these tests, the same four scenarios we used, so load balancing and content inspection, load balancing and AppSec, and then the combination of all three of those. And all of this was done on encrypted traffic. And the throughput was held constant, but this time the latency to complete the request and response in each config scenario was measured. And oh boy, what a difference between the two products. In the baseline scenario, and this is just decrypting the traffic and load balancing it, NetScaler added 47% less latency per request. This is every request. Though to be fair, we're talking about low latencies overall in the single millisecond range. So I'm not too excited about that. But it is similar for the content manipulation and the load balancing. But when we add AppSec inspection, the difference was very marked, with NetScaler adding 77% less latency. As in the previous test run, when we ran the full suite of config, again, the throughput had to be moderated to accommodate the F5 instance because it simply could not complete the testing at the initial throughput level. So the throughput again was cut by 50%. And then we saw that the latency was a whopping 89% less on the NetScaler.
It's interesting that F5, again, could not even complete the test at that initial throughput level. So I guess it looks like the F5 device added a lot of latency to every request then, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we expected some additional latency for the F5 as it doesn't have the single pass architecture that NetScaler had. But the full impact of this is only realized when you flip the expression of the results around and you see that F5 adds between twice as much latency for the baseline testing and 9 times as much latency for the full suite of tests.
So we all know latency is a big issue for applications in terms of maintaining response time, user engagement, and just overall experience. So what does this mean for customers?
That's a great question. So, in the modern world, the application is often the only interaction that a business has with its customers. And if that experience is poor, it'll hit sales and it'll hit reputations. And the differential is massive when the ADCs are asked to carry out these common ADC tasks. F5 seems to really struggle. The fact that the F5 virtual edition adds 18 milliseconds extra latency to every packet is like the data center being an additional distance further away for every user. And if we assume it's not the speed of light, but the packets travel across the internet at about 2/3 the speed of light, then this kind of additional delay be equivalent to approximately 1,000-mile round trip. So obviously this doesn't account for the other delays, but it's better to have less latency, as you'd imagine. And I would want my users to be closer to my data center if I possibly could.
I think now let's take a look at this last test. So the last suite of tests was interesting as we were varying the number of user connections to each device. Is that right?
That is right. So this last suite showed what happened as the total number of users connected to the ADC increases. So we looked at the latency and varied the number of users connected, but kept the workloads the same. So it looked at the full suite of tests. So it's SSL decryption, load balancing, content manipulation, and application security inspection. And we varied the number of users connected between 200 to 4,000, which are fairly typical of a workload that we see across different customers. And what we saw was that as the number of users climbed, the latency added by the NetScaler was pretty much constant at around under 2 milliseconds per request are added. But the F5 device, I don't know, it seemed to fall apart a little bit, pushing in the baseline 9 milliseconds, then 15, 26, and nearly 50 milliseconds per request as the user's connection rose from 200 to 4,000.
That is a surprising result as, those per request milliseconds can start to stack up. And F5 fronts some pretty big sites with lots of users. Is this a result of adding more workload on the device as the number of users increased?
That's a really great question. I was certainly surprised by this. I did not imagine the two devices would be so different. And no, the workload stayed the same throughout the test at 4,000 requests per second. That's what Tolly were testing on each device. And when we had 200 users connected, they were each making 20 requests a second. And with 4,000, it was just a single request per user per second. So no, the induced latency is not a factor of an increasing workload. This is just a measure of increasing the connections. And that latency differentials were between 80 and 96% less for NetScaler. So again, if you flip that around and look at it a different way, it goes from 5 times the latency with 200 users to inducing 26 times more latency when 4,000 users are connected, which is staggering.
Yeah, truly. So what does this mean for NetScaler and F5 customers?
Well, latency, as you know, it equates to user experience and it translates to an increase and the number and size of devices to satisfy a given number of users. So in the enterprise world, maybe the number of users connected might be expected to be from 200 to maybe 2,000. But in the larger enterprises, and we see gateway connections where you've got many thousands of users, and in the e-commerce world, 4,000 connected users on a NetScaler or an ADC is a sort of a medium load, really. And if inducing 18 milliseconds before to every packet, it's like putting the data center halfway across the country, adding 48 milliseconds is like putting the data center in a different continent with all of the user experience associated with it. So I'm being a little bit blasé with that, but to me, this shows that F5 really can't claim to be a viable option for businesses that want a software app delivery solution. And that includes use in the cloud. Perhaps this is why F5 really promote their hardware solutions over software.
So, with such an extensive testing regime, what does it all mean for NetScaler and F5 customers? Can we bring this all together and try to summarize this for the audience?
Sure, Brian. I think that it shows that NetScaler and the way it processes traffic with its single pass architecture is undoubtedly more beneficial to customers. As customers add more workloads to their ADC, which they're doing, NetScaler copes so much better. And that means that customers need fewer or smaller licensed instances of NetScaler for a given workload. And this will have an associated impact on, I think you said it before, on deployment complexity and cost. Moreover, the impact of latency on application performance is very real. You've seen it yourself. If something is slow, you don't hang around. And don't take my word for it on the issues of latency. Just Google it. There are lots of statistics out there that highlight the issues with latency and application performance. So users leave sites as latency increases and bounce rates soar. It reduces transactions because customers prefer, quite rightly, to purchase from speedy sites, and conversions decline. And it hurts the reputation. Shoppers don't return to slow sites, and they buy elsewhere. And moreover, the added latency that F5 introduces on every packet can have a profound impact on the user experience. As I mentioned, it's like adding a lot of distance between the users and the content. That's not something I would want from my content. But for me, as I said earlier, the most astounding and astonishing difference was the impact of just adding users and handling those connections. So managing user connections is kind of job number one on the ADC. It's what it's put there to do, and when a device struggles with that, it's not going to end well. So overall, as more and more customers try to shift to a software ADC, NetScaler really is the only choice from the main vendors.
Nice. So it's interesting that you mentioned the move to software again. And in the spirit of being fair and unbiased, I do want to
Mm-hmm.
ask how these results can be related to hardware devices from NetScaler and F5.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I want to bring this out. So while these tests were done in the cloud, they are surely extendable to other software environments. But we cannot claim that the hardware performances are in line with these tests, right? For a start, both NetScaler and F5 devices have hardware for accelerating SSL encryption and decryption, so the key exchange part. Not the symmetric piece, but the key exchange is done in separate hardware devices inside the boxes. Absolutely, that would have an impact. NetScaler VPX can take advantage of hardware acceleration when it's deployed on a standard server. And so you've got things like called QAT cards or quick assist technology, which fit into these servers the VPX is sitting on, and then the VPX can use those to accelerate those. But we did not test that here because we don't think that F5's virtual edition necessarily supports the same things. We wanted to keep it equal. So also F5 uses ASICs in its hardware to boost the performance. And that's great. And that's their architectural choice and their decision. And it's very good for layer 4 load balancing. It gives them that fast path to layer 4. But I'm not sure how it's going to impact the type of layer 7 decisions that modern applications rely on for delivery. And nor am I sure that their application security and how that's going to fare in the same way. Now, when doing this and having Tolly do this testing, we did some research, and there are some knowledge base articles that look into the architecture of F5, and they try to explain some of the issues that are common on their virtual edition with latency, which, to be fair, they do recognize. That said, the architecture and use of compute resources is different on the hardware devices, and they control the processing power they assign to different tasks. So, what does that mean? So when we've run hardware tests in the past, we've seen F5 devices induce large latency. And this is several years ago. We've run a NetScaler against an F5, and we've seen very large latency added as the number of users connected increases or the CPU increases. And we're not the only vendors to have seen that. Others have seen this as well. And I would not want to comment on whether or not they've addressed that in their hardware to date. Now, they have issued a new operating system. We haven't been testing that. And I'm not going to comment on whether I think that might be faster or slower for them.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to look at that other angle as well and address it so that way our audience knows really what they're looking at and the full picture a bit better. So with all that said, Jason, I want to thank you for taking the time to walk us through all the methodology and the results in a very clear and relatable way. For our audience, I'd like to summarize our conversation. In this episode, we explored the compelling findings of the Tolly Group report comparing the performance of the NetScaler VPX and the F5 Big IP Virtual Edition in realistic ADC environments. And if you listen, the results were staggering, with NetScaler consistently outperforming F5 across various scenarios, demonstrating up to 3 times the throughput, 64% less CPU utilization, and 96% lower latency as the total user connections increased. One of the most significant reasons for this performance disparity was NetScaler's single pass architecture, also known as one pass architecture, which is a design approach that streamlines the processing of network traffic. In single pass architecture, all of the necessary security, load balancing, and content manipulation functions are applied to the data packet in a single processing cycle as it passes through the ADC. This contrasts with many multi-pass architectures where each function might require the packet to be processed separately, adding additional layers of complexity, resource usage, and latency. So, to summarize, the implications are clear. For businesses looking to maximize performance, reduce deployment complexity, and improve that user experience overall, NetScaler is the superior choice. This is particularly important in today's application-driven world where every millisecond of delay can impact user experience and business outcomes. If you're interested in finding these details and you want to see them in a bit more description, be sure to check out the full Tolly report or Jason's blog post explaining these results. Both of these are linked in our episode description. With that said, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.